Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Paul Jay, and I'm at the People's Summit in Chicago. Now joining me is Charles Lenchner. He's the co-founder of People for Bernie. Thanks for joining us,
Thanks
Charles.
for having me again.
So we chatted a year ago at the last People's Summit. We've chatted a few times since. And the discussion's basically a bit about how does that Sanders campaign, the movement to elect Bernie Sanders, which was more than about Bernie Sanders,
right.
Where does it go? So this conference has become like a new focal point for that conversation. Where do you think that's at? What do you find from the motion here, with the ideas here, and in a very dangerous time in terms of climate deniers running the federal government? In my mind, warmongers running the federal government. I have very dangerous stuff coming in the Middle East. These are not normal times where you have like incremental time to build a movement. 2018 and particularly 2020, it's almost a turning point in human history, especially on the climate change side. You know, if you get another 4 years of fossil fuel administration, I don't know if the science is right.
Right.
We're already hitting 2 degrees by 2035, 2040. So to some extent, I don't feel a sense of urgency here.
Right.
It's a little bit like politics is normal, we're going to build a movement. But that sense of there's a very short window here on the climate side. There may be a very short window politically, because I think this is going to be like a Bush-Cheney administration, but worse.
Right. Which
could include, and Chomsky said this too, some kind of false flag terrorist attack, which means Patriot Act on steroids. Like very dangerous times.
My pushback would be is that even if you are objectively correct in your understanding of this current moment, that doesn't translate into a political strategy of telling progressives that they need to be terrified into doing X or Y, even if X or Y is an important thing to do. A movement runs on hope. It runs on a feeling of community. It has to emphasize the positive things that we're fighting for, not the negative things that we're trying to prevent. And in that sense, coming to this space and then bringing it back home to your community is a way of spreading that message and making it accessible to more and more people. In terms of the Bernie movement, you know, during the campaign, you had an official Bernie campaign to be connected to, and now that's gone. The organizations that are the convening partners of the People's Summit represent groups that, to some extent, are new or grew rapidly. Our Revolution, Democratic Socialists of America. These organizations are building greater capacity, developing stronger leadership, and working more closely with each other as a consequence of having that capacity. For me, the People's Summit is where we're knitting together a stronger network and building a more unified politics of hope in order to take on these challenges that you're mentioning. And you need to do both. It's entirely appropriate to talk about the dangers of the Trump administration as a matter of fact, but politics is about mobilizing large numbers of people around a future that they want. And we gotta find a way to square that circle.
Well, I agree completely. There needs to be a vision to fight for. It can't just be the sky is falling, but the sky is falling. So you kind of got, like, I think, like, to me, the message of the Corbyn campaign in the UK and the message of the success of the Sanders campaign here is that we're not going to treat people like idiots anymore. We're actually going to talk about the real problems, to use the word billionaire class, even use the word oligarchy. I mean, for American politics, as you know, it's a great big deal to talk like that. To even acknowledge there's such a thing as a class society, never mind use the word oligarchy. It's supposed to be this, you know, democracy and oligarchy ain't the same thing.
Think of this data point. We saw after the Trump victory that for a moment, the broad, centrist, mass Democratic Party operations were kind of caught by surprise. And there was a moment where I thought that the Bernie forces, the left part of politics, was going to basically, hey, look, we're here. We've been resisting all this time. Join us. But what happened instead is that folks that are essentially Democratic Party hacks came in and walked in front of a large movement that had been energized largely by Bernie Sanders' campaign and by others on the left, and said, okay, we're here, let's move forward. And the reason they were able to do that is that we are still weak, relatively speaking. We do not have that thick blanket of leaders and operatives and folks with the right connections and experiences and ability to cooperate. And that's something that takes a long time. Not to get weird sectarian, but like, I remember being taught that the reason why 1917 worked is because they had 1905. Something comparable in some way is going on here where, sure, the Sanders campaign lost and we haven't achieved our democratic socialist paradise. But that experience of fighting together is what is keeping this movement together in order to fight bigger challenges ahead. And the timelines might not align. Maybe we'll miss the boat and climate and war will screw the pooch. I hope not. I just don't know that you can reverse how people operate.
I would say be more, I'm not saying you personally, I just, everyone.
Yeah.
On top of the fight for the economic equality, economic justice, and so on, which clearly what people need to fight for. You know, you're not going to arouse millions of people just on the question of climate change right now.
Right.
Not partly, to a large extent, because corporate media doesn't even cover the story. People don't get how urgent it is, so which is why we're starting this climate bureau.
But think of the amazing progress made in the last year of prioritizing voices like yours and the Real News, Democracy Now!, other avenues, even The Guardian I consider to be a real ally in this, of creating an alternative media landscape that progressives are able to tune into and not be dependent on the fake news of the New York Times or whatever. That's an amazing thing, but we're still sort of at the beginning of a trajectory. And I feel as though the large numbers of people representing websites and Facebook pages and all the videographers and the live streamers, I still feel like, you know, the best days, the largest audiences are still to come.
I agree, but like I'm starting to try to have some of these conversations in the media world that we need to do something radically more, for example, to create more scale amongst independent media. It's not just about collaboration. We've got to think about even more than collaboration, because we're still wind up being competitive economically because we're trying to fundraise from the same places.
Right.
And there's still politically, there's certainly tremendous energy in these, and it's very exciting actually to see here all these people running in races, and every 5 minutes somebody's coming up to our booth. You know, I'm running here and I'm running here, and it's a very important development.
Well, there needs to be a conversation about where all the money in media is going.
Well, let me just. But what's missing, I think, and it's connected to this issue of sense of urgency, because if there was time, it'd be fine to have so many spontaneous things happening all over the place, somewhat anarchistically. But given the urgency of the window here, doesn't there need to be stronger national structure, some actual broad front with some type of organization? You know, Syriza, you may not have liked where the politics ended up. On the other hand, it became this broad front of left groups for a while that was changed the politics of Greece. Podemos has had some of that effect in Spain, and something where it isn't business as usual, that everybody's doing their own thing and kind of get together during an election for a few months.
My answer is I don't think there can be, you know, the one ring that unites them all in American politics. I think that our strength is in something that's distributed, autonomous, coordinated, more in line with the kind of distributed big organizing model that Becky Bond and Zach Exley were promoting on the Bernie Sanders campaign. It's not going to look like masses of people with the same logo and the same identification card, you know, figuring out a way to join the same thing at the same time. I actually think it's going to be a lot more about an alignment that has lots of actors figuring out how to march together at the same time. But again, it's a process. It's not something where if our revolution, for example, were to somehow grow large enough, then that would be it. It can't ever be it, because even the people that are members of their local chapters are often members of other organizations at the same time. There's a moment now.
But isn't that how it works? I mean, isn't that how an American kind of front would work? Exactly. Like everyone's got to keep doing their own thing, while they're also, at least on some basic principles, like it kind of happened with the Sanders campaign. The problem is it's an election campaign, not an ongoing broad front. There are a myriad of groups in that but for that time we're all also Sander-esque, right?
I'm pessimistic that without someone A, who has the popularity of Sanders, and B, in a presidential election, if those two things don't exist, I don't think an organization, a name, a brand, a single one can actually fill that void. So in my mind, the question is, where you see the energy bubbling up, how do you create alignment while giving lots of deference and respect to these other organizations and constituencies? And especially because of the way that our country is fractured on class and race and immigration status and other lines, it's almost counterproductive to try and get everyone together. Because then you immediately say, okay, we're all together, but who's number one and who's number two? It's much easier when you build broad coalitions and make it something a little bit more amorphous.
So as you head towards 2018 and 2020, there's a fight that we've been talking about all along.
Mm-hmm.
You know, to what extent can this take place as again, a fight within the Democratic Party? There's a lot of voices coming up. You know, there's this draft Bernie idea. I don't know Bernie's in on drafting Bernie, but given how critical this 2020 election is, in my mind, it's probably the most important election in the history of the country, and maybe the history of humans.
Right.
How do you see this unfolding, and both in relationship movement building and the fight within the party?
To be very concrete, I think we have a very specific danger on the Democratic side, and that's folks like Cory Booker or Rahm Emanuel or Andrew Cuomo running as progressives when really they're neoliberals using social issues to mask their true intentions. And on the other hand, you have folks like Elizabeth Warren, who I think is a more viable candidate because of her age and experience. She's not the best person ideologically to my taste, but I do think her or someone similar, I've heard Van Jones floated, I've heard Keith Ellison mentioned, but a unifying figure that instead of being our leader, is someone who's going to represent a broad movement in a better way, a more organic way where we actually have a give and take in a relationship. I think that's possible, and the key to me is to make sure that we don't replicate a situation where all the political money goes up and then trickles back down. My vision is one where more political money goes sideways, stays in communities, is raised and spent by all the independent groups, like you had in the Bernie Sanders campaign, figuring out what's necessary in their community instead of being so single-mindedly trying to move all the resources up and then back down again, you know, strategically according to consultants. And I think that's something that with technology today you can actually accomplish.
At the moment, it looks like it's going to be Sanders again, doesn't it?
I'm nervous about going on record on something where I might accidentally offend one of my allies, but I don't think Sanders is interested. I don't think he's the right person for 2020. I think that talking about that is more of a vehicle for an organization to have a wedge issue with other mainstream Democrats. But it's not really a serious conversation.
Because Van Jones, I cannot imagine, is a unifying figure. I mean, Van Jones is considered by, I think, much of the Sanders movement as a Clinton-esque corporate Democrat.
I mean, I could see the case being made. In my opinion, he's much better than that. I do see him as an inspirational figure. I know that Van Jones has very deep politics, and he's figured out a way, you know, to have an impact on the American landscape. But I want to say, I think we have to keep the focus on the movement and not surrender to a charismatic figure. So
why do you say Sanders doesn't want it? That one knows or doesn't know. But why do you think he wouldn't be the right person for the time?
I think that where our country...
Who else has the recognition, profile, name, and has also been polling the most popular politician in the country?
I mean, if you were talking about a primary right now, I feel like that's a really weighty argument. But we've got a couple years to sort this out. In my opinion, he was always a little bit of an odd bird coming from Vermont, being in a state that is not as diverse as the rest of America is, and coming with ideas that were new to Americans. I would like to see a champion who is more naturally emerging from a context where the executive experience or the policy victories or the movement connections in the sense of having been embedded within movements over time is something very real. So Bernie Sanders has done an amazing job, and I'll always be loyal to him. I don't think he's making a different calculation and is thinking about 2020. I think he's asking the question, how can he take this movement and extract the most leverage on the process so that someone good is elected next time?
All right, thanks for joining us, Charles.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.